Good afternoon and good morning to everyone from coast to coast, and welcome to today's webinar, Conquering the Small Campus Facilities Challenge. My name is Mary Neal Jackson, and I will be your moderator for today's session, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We're thrilled to be spending this time with each and every one of you this afternoon. Today's session will feature an esteemed panel of small campus facilities leaders and experts. Maureen Soha, Assistant Vice President of Administration and Facilities at Springfield Technical Community College, and Roland Homer, Vice President of Facilities and Campus Planning at ArtCenter College of Design, will be joining Sightlines Regional Director Gabby Rosas to discuss how they're overcoming their many facilities challenges by leveraging data as a communication tool for obtaining investment objectives on campus. On this slide, you'll see a quick review of housekeeping items, but before, let's go through today's agenda. So Gabby will provide a brief introduction to Sightlines and discuss some of the issues compounding the small campus facilities challenge. Maureen will then share how STCC has used data to elevate the needs of facilities on campus and rationalize decision-making, while Roland will discuss their tactical approach to more effectively communicating facilities needs with senior leadership. And of course, lastly, we'll set aside some time at the end of the presentation to respond to your questions. So on this slide, I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions or comments during the presentation for our speakers, please don't hesitate to share those with us as you think of them. We'd like for this to be an interactive session and very much look forward to answering any questions that come up along the way. I'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to address as many of them as time permits at the conclusion of the presentation. To submit a question or comment, simply enter it into the questions box on your control panel, and they will be sent directly to us. Following today's session, each of you will receive an email that contains links to both the presentation slides and webinar recording for your continued engagement with this material. We'll also be sure to include some complimentary content that we think you might find valuable. So keep an eye out for that email tomorrow. I'd also like to call your attention to the handout section of your control panel. Handouts gives you instant access to complementary resources such as previous webinar presentations, best practices guides, trends and benchmarking reports, and relevant case study documents. You can check those out at any time during the session, and we absolutely encourage you to do so. And with that, I will pass it off to Gabby to get us started.
Thank you, Mary Neal. Good afternoon, everyone. To start us off, I want to briefly introduce Sightlines as a firm. So we work with institutions in higher education to help them make data-driven decisions regarding their facilities. We apply the same analytical rigor that is often used to manage an institution's endowment, but we focus that on the physical assets, really understanding the value and the impact that managing the physical assets can have on the campus community. By using a common vocabulary, consistent methodology, and a common platform to share each institution's message from the boiler room to the boardroom. And today we're going to go through a couple of different examples of how we're able to do that with some of our member institutions. Sightlines as a firm, it works with over 450 colleges and universities across the country. We experience an annual retention rate of over 90%, which allows us to truly understand the industry and the trends. We're applying the industry knowledge for today's webinar to speak specifically to the challenges small campuses are facing. Now, while we work all across the country, we do also work within a number of systems, and we host quite a few different databases. But today's focus is going to be on some of the challenges that the members of institutions smaller than 1 million square feet are facing throughout their growth and what they're experiencing when dealing with enrollment changes. So when we're talking about smaller campuses specifically, we understand that small campuses are facing a lot of the same issues that larger institutions or larger campuses do face with regards to aging facilities or limited capital. But small institutions are facing other challenges at the same time. We could be in a situation where we're putting out too many fires, or we don't have enough individuals involved to tell the story of what's happening within our facilities and the changing environment that we're experiencing on campus. So while we're already experiencing an aging environment, we are also not able to pull all the different data sets together. We may be limited in our operations and have a limited economy of scale for how to share that message with leadership. And that's the focus of today's webinar. The outlook for higher education as a whole is that everyone needs to be making the best or most strategic decisions as possible. Something we're seeing in the media over time is the media is laying out an indicator that higher education is in a financial crisis. And over the last 3 years, chief business officers have been agreeing with that outlook. And that's really pointing us in the direction of making stronger strategic decisions across all of our institutions. We want to enable institutions to make more informed decisions about their financial output, their spendings, their capital funding, things of that nature. So when we're talking about the small campus landscape as a whole, we're looking at 2 different areas here. The chart on the left is looking at the percentage of officers at small colleges that say their campuses were financially stable, just over 51%. But then we're looking at a budgetary deficit experienced at those same types of institutions. So ultimately, we're dealing with a situation where a lot of smaller institutions are going through mergers, through acquisitions. We're seeing that at a higher rate over this period of time than we have before. Now, part of the reason for this is dealing with a lot of the physical characteristics of the campus, of these smaller campuses, is that we have competing priorities. When we're talking about competing priorities, we really want to talk historically about the construction trends that we're seeing nationally, where higher education has gone through significant construction booms over this period of time. Now, the blue area on this chart is looking at the construction age and when we've seen facilities grow or be built on college campuses. So before 1951, this was the pre-war era, where we didn't see significant waves of construction. But then after 1951, in the post-war era, significant growth, taking advantage of troops returning back, GI Bill, but also just significant growth within higher education as a whole. That continued through the modern era. And most recently, we're looking at the complex era, where institutions started building more technically complex facilities, higher quality, more expensive to maintain. And when we're looking at these different construction trends over time, this creates a very diverse portfolio that institutions have to manage. And smaller institutions oftentimes don't have the personnel who are making this translation from the boiler room to the boardroom. That we're dealing with these situations on a year in, year out basis, trying to make decisions about how do we grow, but then how do we also maintain some of these facilities that were built in the post-war era that are coming due and have fairly significant needs from a reinvestment standpoint. When we're talking about the different construction qualities, it's also very important to point out that those facilities built in the post-war and the modern era are of lower quality. That those are the facilities that are, now 50, 60, 70 years old, but they are the facilities that need the most modernization. They need the most upgrades, and important decisions need to be made about whether or not those facilities are going to stay on the college campus. And that's going to be a portion of today's webinar as well, is talking about decision making in that regard. So what does the data tell us about small campuses? When we're looking at the trends for small campuses as a whole, when we look at the space versus enrollment growth, enrollments are stagnant. The bars represent growing square footage, whereas the blue dotted line is representing enrollment growth. So we haven't seen the enrollment growth keep pace with the space growth, and that's causing financial issues for the institutions. We've also seen capital investments, the middle chart, decline over the last few years. A little bit of an uptick in 16, but we have not seen a similar expenditure back into existing facilities as what we've seen with growth. And finally, looking at the facilities operating costs, on a dollar per square foot basis, we are seeing those numbers increase year over year, but they are not keeping pace with what the true cost of ownership is across our college campuses. We want to highlight that while it is positive that we are seeing change here, we are constantly reviewing benchmarks and year-to-year analysis to help evaluate what is the appropriate amount of spending or the appropriate budget that should be allocated toward facilities to really protect those investments. Because protecting the construction is really the eye on the prize here. It's really what we're trying to advocate for. When we're speaking about the average endowment, every institution can rattle off what that average endowment is or what their endowment has changed, how that endowment has changed over the past 3, 5, 10 years. But talking to the replacement value of the facilities, this is something that institutions have not been keeping an eye on. And while working with Sightlines, we're able to help advocate for some of that change and able to help advocate for investing back into those facilities at a different rate than what we were previously. So while we've seen that growth, we've seen a lot of facilities added in the past 5, 10, 20 years, we need to start advocating for putting those resources back into those facilities, but what are those additional operating costs for the college campuses? So today we have 2 examples with Springfield Technical Community College and ArtCenter, where we're going to go through different ways that we've been able to make the case for change within the administration, the way the administration is approaching decision making, and how data is really driving a lot of this conversation. So next, we're going to jump right into the Springfield Technical Community College example to give a little background on this campus, where it's located in Springfield, Massachusetts, established in 1967. Built on the site of the Springfield Armory National Park, and it's a member of the Massachusetts Community College System, or DCAM. We're talking about 34,000 students being educated, 3,400 students being educated on campus across 25 buildings and about 1.1 million gross square feet. And I'm going to pass it over to Maureen, who has 7 years of experience with the college, and she's going to walk us through what some of the key points are for how they've been able to use data to drive the conversation on their campus.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you can all hear me. A little bit more about STIC in general. As Gabby pointed out, we are a part of a larger state system. And as such, we share kind of this pot of money that the state hands out for deferred maintenance and capital projects. But the key here is that it's to all state agencies. So they have a pretty tough job. DCAM has to kind of manage life safety projects with regular capital projects and capital project improvements. So that's a pretty tough job that they have. Locally, I receive about $3 million a year for deferred maintenance and capital projects from our budget here at STIC. That's approved by the board every year. As Gabby said, I have about 1 million square feet, 35 acres. My buildings are range in age from the 1800s. Actually, a little fact, George Washington approved the fence line that goes all the way around the campus because it was one of the original armories. and go in our what we call our new buildings, our buildings that were built in the 1970s and 80s. Because of the historic nature of our campus and the majority of our buildings, we have kind of the unique pleasure of adding to our everyday costs and needs with anytime we dig, we have to have an archaeologist on site that oversees the project. We have also just learned about lead in most of the soil across campus, again, because we're an armory. The residual effects of that has been a lot of lead in most of the soil across campus. So that just adds to the particular cost of anything that we do. Because of those costs, what you'll see today is we are kind of an outlier when DCAM and the state look at facilities needs in general. And I think just generally the lack of deferred maintenance money throughout the years have really pushed our numbers off the charts. So as I explained in my introduction, we have buildings that were built in the 1800s, and the new buildings, which, as Gabby mentioned earlier, come from the low quality years of the 1970s and 80s. I believe that that peak on the left-hand side, the green, has probably been the majority of our buildings. Of the million square feet, about 350,000 square feet are the buildings that were built in the 70s and 80s, and the 650,000 square feet are the older buildings built in the 1800s. So that means we deal with brick facades, and the brick is aged and is in desperate need of repointing and repair. All the old windows everywhere. One of the biggest problems we have is that there is no central air conditioning in the older buildings, so we have just a ton of window air conditioners. Okay, and here's some kind of historic information that, again, what we can gather from Sightlines and all of the work we do from them. This data is extremely important. What this shows is what looks like a great investment of capital funds into the campus, but if you'll see on the right-hand side, it's a little bit of an explanation of some of the bigger projects that were done in those years. What I can tell you is that when you count them up, there's 10 projects. Building 19 renovation is an ongoing project, so I'm counting that as one. And of those 10 projects that you see here, 5 of those were emergency, urgent situations. And that, of course, taxes us from a staffing point of view, and the state has to come up with kind of these emergency funds to take care of things. Some of the larger, more complicated emergencies that we had in FY15, the heating plant was a centralized high-pressure steam plant. It was finally condemned after a number of studies that said it was going to fail. Well, it finally failed, and the whole heating plant was condemned. We ended up decentralizing the campus so that if something happens again, it's only one building, not the entire campus. And even at that, a lot of the infrastructure that supported the buildings was not replaced. So we still have that we're dealing with. In fiscal year 16, the electric loop, I got a call from the campus police one night. It was actually Sunday, Father's Day, in the afternoon, and they said, there's no power on campus. I said, well, we have a redundant feed, so I don't know what's going on. They said, well, don't know what that means, but there's no power anywhere on campus. So that was obviously, that was a tricky one to get up and back up in line temporarily until we could come up with a long-term solution without missing classes. I think we had to cancel classes for 2 days until we had our temporary repairs done in order to proceed with classes. And what this doesn't show is the numerous floods and other emergencies. So what this slide really shows, and again, the data support, we always can go back to the data because of the work we do with Sightlines, is that you know, it's nice to have the increase in funding, but it would be much nicer to have it a planned project versus an emergency project. Okay, so this slide really indicates where we want to be. It's always a struggle to kind of maintain a balance. Every single penny we have and every single penny that the state has or can give us, we could certainly put towards infrastructure and building systems and safety code requirements and safety upgrades. But on the right-hand side, you'll see some information that came from a survey that Sightlines helped us with to say these are some of the student and faculty concerns and what we should be looking at. So even though we could pour every one of our dollars into the buildings, it is a balance that we try to review every day to say, you know, we need that space renewal. We need the buildings to look current. We need that curb appeal from people that are driving on campus. We need to continue to let the campus bring people in, especially given the challenges of enrollment and the declining enrollment. We certainly don't want our buildings and ground to be a deterrent for that. Thank you. In this next slide, so part of the information that we were able to gather with Sightlines is of our deferred maintenance critical needs, what is the priority? And this was kind of done hand in hand with Sightlines, as well as they assessed what the needs were as well. So as you can see, we are in the great big, all of the red, 84%. That time frame right now, this study was done about a year ago. So right now we're looking at a 0 to 3 year need. Over $200 million is a priority one. And again, most of this is infrastructure, safety, and trying to get ahead of some of these emergencies. Clearly, it's the majority of our needs. I use this continually to balance our spending and try to get this a little bit more equalized. You know, sometimes it feels like it's an uphill battle, emergency after emergency. And I know that other state agencies everyone is vying for the same money. But the emergencies really do cost probably a third to a half more, depending on what the emergency is, and really takes a toll on our staffing. And most importantly, we really try not to disturb the student experience. So if something happens, we try to make quick plans for alternate solutions so that we're not disrupting our students, but it can be challenging. One of the key takeaways from this particular slide is this slide is one of my president's favorite slides. It really shows what our need is comparably to the other community colleges in the system. The board of directors has seen this slide. This is a real valuable slide, and this really helps us to continue with our $3 million of local funding, because clearly there's other places that I'm sure they would like to use the funding for, but if they don't continue that, then that number is just going to get larger. And this slide is one of my favorite slides. I use this slide all the time. I keep it in my portfolio, and every meeting I have, there's not a meeting that I go to that I don't refer to this slide. This is a building breakdown of the cost, the deferred maintenance cost over 10 years. Again, that red is the 0 to 3 years, 0 to 3 year need. In particular, you'll see the first building in the $68 million range. That's our health sciences building. So this, if there's one building that keeps me up at night, this is the building. We, unlike a building that would house English classes, general studies classes, our health building is so specific that if something catastrophic happens to that building, I can't relocate those classes. We have a simulated OR, we have SIMS patients, and so it would be impossible to relocate those classes. So again, this slide is probably one of the most telling slides that there is as far as kind of a facilities management slide. And here we are again. If this were in, if we could compare these, this $3 million or $300 million would be off the charts here. And again, this is comparing us to all of our other peer institutions. And as you can see, you know, everybody has a need, and this is the struggle that that we have. The state really has its hands full with the growing need and the growing number of deferred maintenance needs on campuses. And with the competition among students, the critical time for enrollment and the number of emergencies that happen when your deferred maintenance numbers go up, it's just staggering. On the good part of it is my team responds so well right now to emergencies. We've kind of got it down pat. I guess that's good and bad that we even have to do that. And again, our number one goal is to take care of these interruptions with little to no interruption for the students. We do have some hope on the horizon. We are in the final stages of renovating one of our larger buildings on campus, which has been vacant since the campus opened. 100,000 square foot building, and we are set to open that this fall. And what that will do is create a building with all student services and a learning commons. And the best part about it is we'll be able to vacate some of these older buildings and hopefully chop away at that deferred maintenance need. This is working with Sightlines. The data is incredible, and what they can supply us is incredible. But there are times that I want to look at certain specific part of projects and part of our needs. And you know, it's not really a one-size-fits-all, and they're able to help us with whatever we're asking for. So this is one of the specific projects that I've looked at. We have a kind of a small operating budget for the size that we are, and that operating budget was getting eaten alive because of all of the emergencies. And again, you know, the team is great at responding to emergencies, but you know, I think people were just like, yes, thanks, and move on. So we put this together and to just illustrate kind of over a 2 or 3 year period every single emergency that happened. And these were, you know, over thresholds, so that, you know, we weren't talking about just the small floods or the small failures. These were, you know, rather large emergencies that happened on campus that we couldn't really take care of ourselves, that we needed the state emergency funding to help us with. Again, this slide talks about our overtime. In this overtime, we also have some of the snow removal. But that is generally kind of probably where my peers are. That probably is where their numbers are coming from. The high numbers for us is, again, dealing with all the emergencies on campus. Of course, it can never be on a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. that these things happen. It's usually Tuesday at 2 a.m. in the morning. So everybody has to come in. It's all hands on deck to help mitigate the immediate problems, and then work to recover the area as soon as we can. So this again is another area that we specifically took the data and said, what are we looking at here, and how can I bring this forward? And what this has done is really opened everybody's eyes as to what we were spending on overtime to deal with these emergencies, and can we get additional staff? Because when you work all night on a flood, then you certainly can't work all the next day on taking care of your building or doing what you're supposed to be doing. So this really has helped me bring issues forward with data-driven answers, or actually questions as to how we can continue this without additional staffing. So this slide again is our overtime versus peers again, and you can see that 14, 15, and 16. If you remember on the map that we had a little while ago, those have been our significant failures. And this again is a great way to illustrate to everyone on campus, the administration on campus, as to why we need to continue getting the local funding, and it's also helped with emergency funding at the state level. Another kind of real specific to STIC project that I worked with Sightlines on. We do a lot of events on campus because we're a community college. The community can use our theater and some other kind of conference rooms. My concern was growing that the cleaning part of our buildings was going down, but our events were rising. And it's the same staff that does that. We call them maintainers or janitorial staff, but they have to clean their buildings and do all the setups and breakdowns. So this, again, was a data-driven decision that really looked at that and what was going on, and the events are increasing, but my staffing was staying the same. So this enabled us to really take a look at that, change some staffing models, and address the area much differently, again, with the data that supports the request. I know I'm running out of time. I'm trying to talk fast. So this is part of the survey that we did on campus to the staff, faculty, and students. Sometimes we're up to our ears in alligators, and we don't always take the time to say, what do you need? What are your needs? What would you like to see? Kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak, and we would try to do as much as we could. So this is, instead of assuming we know what everybody thinks, this is kind of a great thing that came out of that survey. Any survey, be ready for it, because you're going to get good and bad. But again, we were able to actually ask, and we were able to take the questions and some of the responses and take care of some of the immediate needs that we knew we could, and then the other needs that were identified, we were able to put those into our 5-year capital plan and know that these are repairs and or renovations that were asked for by the staff, students, and faculty. So I guess this slide kind of says it all. Some of the takeaways are, these studies that we do, the data that's given, as I said, is not really a one-size-fits-all. You can use it for staffing needs, for projections, for budgeting purposes. It's not the kind of information or data that just sits on a shelf. I do use this all the time, and it's great information to take forward to talk about staffing and talk about staffing needs, and can we get additional staffing, which I'm sure everyone knows is very difficult to do. It helps to reinforce our needs statewide and here locally. As I said, the board continues to fund our local money every year because of the results of the Sightlines survey. I take this to our president's cabinet as well as board meetings, and everyone's always very interested in what we have to offer here. So with that being said, I think my part is done.
Okay, thank you, Maureen.
Right.
Also, your next steps, do you want to talk briefly about just what's on your horizon while working on changing the campus?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we have a $50 million renovation going on. The state has funded. It was in a 2008 bond bill. The funding was, and it finally was released about 2 years ago. And we're renovating a building that was built in 1863. It's about 100,000 square feet. And what that will do is start the campus migration northward. I'll be able to, quote, mothball some of these buildings. We still, according to the National Park Memorandum of Understanding, we still have to keep the buildings up. But operationally, to me, that means we can get the people out, we can start working on operational savings, and move into this new building that's probably one of the most high-tech buildings that we'll have on campus, but be able to reinvest some of the savings back into the academic buildings, and hopefully take a big chunk of those deferred maintenance needs off. I mean, it's really the only way we're going to see significant savings in that $300 million need is to just start closing some of these buildings. Otherwise, it'll be impossible to ever catch up.
Thank you for telling your story and what's going on your campus. I'm sure quite a few of our webinar attendees can feel what the situation is for STIC and what some of the potential outlooks are for the campus. Next, we want to shift gears and start talking about ArtCenter College of Design. We have Roland on the phone, who is going to be telling us a little bit more about his two campuses. But just to give a general overview of ArtCenter, this campus is located in Pasadena, California, opened in 1930. We're actually talking about two separate campuses that enroll almost 2,000 students, and it currently covers about 563,000 gross square feet. And with that, Roland, why don't you tell us a little bit more about just the enrollment and space growth that your college has been experiencing?
Great. Good morning to everyone. So just a little bit quickly about the history of the school. We started out as an advertising school just over 80 years ago. For those that don't know ArtCenter or are not familiar with them, you probably interact with the things our alumni create every day. If we had a football team, our football team would be our transportation department. We have about 50% of all car designers in the world have come through ArtCenter. If you saw Man of Steel, the Superman movie that came out recently, that was from Zack Snyder, who was an alum. If you've seen any Transformer movies in the past few years, Michael Bay is also an alum. If you've ever had the Got Milk commercials, That's an alum and faculty member that came up with that advertising campaign, and I can go on and on. But in any case, a little bit of that history. So we are a private college. We are tuition-based. If you look at our 80 years of history of existence, and you looked at the expansion timeline of the schools, typically about every 10 to 15 years, we add space, either by relocating or building new campuses. In 1976, we opened our Hillside campus that we refer to, which is above the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. We built the first custom building for the school, which we call the Elwood building after the architect Craig Elwood. In 2004, we opened our second campus, our South Campus in Pasadena. This was at 950 Raymond. And for all intents and purposes, this building should have actually hit a normal growth cycle for the institution. However, for various reasons that were happening with that administration and the city at that time, that growth and use of that building didn't actually materialize, which compounded sort of our problem with our Hillside campus. So in 2010, we had a leadership change and we got a new president. So from 2010 to 2012, the school went through a visioning process that led into a strategic plan. Out of that plan came a goal of 2 campuses, 1 center. We also completed what we called our academic facilities master plan. This was a plan that basically gave us the building blocks for classroom types and the amounts of spaces that we would need to accommodate the anticipated educational growth. It also highlighted at that time that we needed about another 100,000 square feet of space in order to offer the types of spaces needed by each department. So in 2012, we also closed escrow on an adjacent property next to our 950 Raymond building, which we call 870 Raymond, and we started our master plan process. Fast forward to 2014, we acquired another building at our South Campus, 1111 Arroyo, and we then thereafter restarted the master plan process. We also at that time created the first version of our 2-campus distribution of departments and services, outlining the growth needs for each building, each department, so on and so forth. The enrollment growth plan at this time was to be at 2,000 students by 2020. In 2014, we were already up to 1,600 students, and that was up 400 students from 2010. So in 2015 is when we first engaged with Sightlines. And as you can see, by the time we engaged with them, we actually had 4 buildings. So we had Elwood on our Hillside campus, which was 40 years old. Typical situation, the building was never maintained to the level that was needed. And essentially we had 40-year-old systems that were failing, both the electrical, mechanical, so on and so forth. We had 950 Raymond, which was 12 years old, but not really programmable through some bad design choices at the time. We had our 870 Raymond building, which was now in 2015 completely remodeled, but it was also the smallest building in our portfolio. And then we had 1111 Arroyo. So 1111 Arroyo was a 6-story office building that would need to be renovated over a period of years and turned into classroom space. It had 35-year-old systems that were somewhat maintained, but it was also 35% occupied with outsourced tenants with leases ranging from 6 months to 5 years. So if you look across the board at this time, you can see our density to our peers is much higher than normal. This is mostly due to the type of education we offer. So we specialize in unique and dedicated spaces, meaning if you're going to teach film, you got to have a film studio, and not a normal classroom. If you're going to teach photography, you got to have editing bays and so on and so forth. We also, the school is focused on having faculty who are professional working faculty who basically come in and teach 5-hour-long studio classes once a week. So we have a schedule that's really based on trying to get the industry's best into the classroom with our students. We can go to the next slide here. So basically, when we got involved with Sightlines, as you can see by our investment up to 2015, we were really focusing on, we had been focusing on acquisition in 2012, acquisition in 2015, and really coming up with the early stages of a plan to be able to implement, to convert all these spaces. Our strategy up until even right now has been focused on empty space or space that is not in use by the school currently. And this is done basically to allow for growth, but also to be able to open up space in other buildings that need renovation. So you can see by 2016, we're sort of done with acquisition, and we're now fully into full swing on renovations, and we're going to be projecting to be in this state for the next 5 to 6 years. We can go to the next slide. You can just punch through these. I think they pull up each way. So, so we needed to come up with a plan, and what Sightlines was able to do for us is to really sit down with us and create the building portfolio survey, which allowed us to identify all of our needs. So basically in 15, we said we had about $128 million worth of need. 35 of that was slated on the project list for new student housing. We're one of the only ACAD art and design schools that does not have student housing. Just under $5 million is projects that are out 10 years. And then we estimate about $10 million in overlap projects. And that brings us down to about $78 million in projects for the foreseeable future that are based on either renovations or backlog or so on. We can go to the next slide. So as we try to break down this number, both to the executive staff and the board, again, we just keep chipping away and saying, what do we have? What do we know? So you can see here that there is a limited amount of money in our operational budget that could be equated to about $7 million over a 10-year period. That would reduce our funding need to about $71 million. Go ahead and next slide. So if you start back with $78 million, we have about $36 million that we identified could be done through fundraising. So this would be basically for major renovations, new space coming online, or rehabbing old space, changing one department into a space versus another. And the executive cabinet, as we went through this, felt very comfortable with saying about $36 million could be identified as a potential for fundraising. We'd already raised $15 million by this point to go towards some renovation of space and new major projects, leaving our 78 down to 42 million, take off the 7. And now we're saying basically we have about 35 million of funding, true funding need that has no real source of funding other than either operational cost or bonds or proceeds out of reserves. And like most of you, this would be the things that nobody wants to fund, such as mechanical systems, electrical systems, so on and so forth. Next slide. This is where we take all that information and we started to break it down for the board. And I would say, again, when you think about information and being able to have to share this in a way that people can digest it, we really looked and took to heart sort of how do you tackle this $35 million project list in a 10-year period, and how much funding do you need for that? In our case, I use these numbers, if not daily, definitely weekly. Our minimum number that we need to hold is at the time was 2.1 million or 2.8 million. And again, this was the number on the annual investment target. This was the number just to say, I can keep the backlog steady. We're not going to increase the backlog. We'll make some advances on it, but we're definitely not tackling the problem, but we're just maintaining the ship, if you will, or maintaining the building's failure. What we really need, and I express this to the board and everyone, is we really need an average of 5.1 million to really get this list tackled over this period of time and really make headway into getting beyond reacting to failure and being proactive in our maintenance and upkeep of our buildings. Let's go to the next slide. So if you were the board and you looked across against our peers, you can see that we have a higher reinvestment need than a lot of our peers. If you hit the little button on BPS, there you go. So we used basically the peer data, we used the annual investment need, we used sort of the breaking down of numbers to really be able to create a plan based off the BPS to create a plan that shows here's what we would actually do in expenditure for the next 5 years, so from 16 to 2022. And when we outlined this plan, what we actually did for the board was we created what we called our building portfolio report. So this is typically, to understand our board reports in the past, it was basically, here's an update on the major projects, here we're on target, we're on budget, so on and so forth, here's what we have coming up, we need you to approve. With the building portfolio report that we created, what we did is we took all the information from Sightlines, we took the BPS list, we prioritized everything into years based on educational needs and so on, and then we overlaid that with finances. I've been working with the CFO in our finance office. Basically, what we create is a 5-year plan, and this report gets updated every board meeting, which is 3 times a year. And in this report, we show all of our major projects. Then we hold a line item for the unfunded projects, which we call our facilities and repairs and replacement list. And then essentially, accounting and the CFO can then overlay where our reserves are at, how much money we would need to borrow if we were looking at new bonds for some of these projects, how much would we spend if we just used our reserves, what would it look like if we got a bond to do housing, so on and so forth. And basically, this allows the board to make decisions both in all of our capital projects and the financial, our financial expenditure as well. So we can go to our next slide. So by the time we had all this put together, this was, and I think we really streamlined this project and had it really working well, was January of 2017. In January 2017, we were able to actually go into the board and show them the building portfolio report that showed the outlook for the next 5 years. And it was contemplating basically 2 large agenda items. The first was, should we continue on the path of building a student housing project, which would require new bonds? And the second being, here's all the educational needs to renovate space and bring online buildings that we had purchased and so on. In the conservative modeling, we were able to show basically there was a path that we could borrow bonds for the housing. However, by the time we got to the end of the 5 years, we had used up our reserves on all the educational space. If you took out the student housing, the reserve stays strong, and we're able to accomplish the academic spaces. And basically at that point, the board decided with that information to be able to say, let's pause the housing for 5 years and focus on educational space. You fast forward 1 year later, and education had grown to around 2,000 students, just over 2,000 students actually, and our finances were even better than they were before. Our reserves were larger, Additionally, education showed a need for additional space with all the growth that we hadn't accommodated in our original plan. The only way for us to get this new space was to construct a new building, which opened the door again for the student housing project to come back as a mixed-use building based in our master plan at our South Campus. So with that information at this point, combined still with the Sightlines data that showed how all this fits in a 5-year timeline, the board approved going in and getting a Moody's rating, investment grade rating. This was the first time in the school's history that we were able to go out for this type of rating, which we've received, and it's been favorable. And in this coming June, we will go back to the board for the first of most likely 2 bond issuance. One is to redo our existing debt and to take out some additional bonds to cover some of our renovation project needs, as well as some of our major projects. And then what we're looking at is probably next February, a secondary bond that would allow the housing project to keep going forward into construction. So with that, that sort of wraps up where ArtCenter is and how we've used the information that we work with Sightline to compile.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you for sharing the story for ArtCenter. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Mary Neal. Let us know if there are any questions for either Maureen or for Roland, and we can spend the last few minutes here going over those.
Okay, thank you, Gabby, and thank you both to Maureen and Roland for sharing your experiences and stories. I would think they're very insightful to all of our attendees, so thank you very much. To echo Gabby, if you have any questions, please take a moment to submit those now. And while we wait for your questions to trickle in, I'd like to let you all know that you'll be receiving a post-webinar survey as you close out of today's session. It's a short survey. It should probably only take about a minute or 2 to complete, and is designed to not only get your thoughts on the content of today's presentation, but to also get a sense for the challenges that you face on campus and what you'd like to hear from us at future events and in future reports. It really goes without saying, we really love to hear from you and to hear your input. All right, we'll give you just another minute or 2 to submit your questions. All right, can you talk a little bit about the BPS process? How is that information gathered?
Sure, I can answer this one, and just as a brief overview for Sightlines, and then pass it over to Maureen and Roland. But basically what Sightlines does is we're trying to gather as many of the existing reports as possible, as well as come to campus and do an on-site evaluation of the individual buildings and all of the different assets on campus. So we're compiling a lot of information together to basically provide a lot of the charts and graphs, as well as the information reporting that you saw throughout today's webinar. Maureen, Roland, do you two want to speak specifically to the individuals that we worked with on your teams? Well, maybe let's start with Maureen.
Sure. We work with Adam, and basically that's exactly what they do. They come in on site, we review what the needs are and what they do an evaluation, they walk around, they look at everything. Particularly, we supply them with, if we recent projects, because the costs are so skewed here because of the historic nature of the buildings, we give them kind of real costs, because that historic value really can really bump up numbers. So they evaluate the buildings, and then we really sit down for a good day or 2 reviewing everything, going over building by building, space by space. So it's a thorough analysis when it's done, and that's why we can be so confident with the information.
Yeah, and I would say on our side, this was the first time the school had ever done anything like this, meaning we didn't have any way to really track what was happening with the facilities prior to this. We had a pretty good list for campus renovations and based off the educational need. However, just the state of, the actual systems, I would say were just generally known by our facilities team, but it was just never compiled in this way. And it was never actually in a way that actually showed replacement value or the cost to actually fix these items. So for us, working with the team really just allowed us to kind of take all that knowledge out of people's heads and put it down in a way that we could explain it. So.
Great, thank you all. So it looks like we are right at the 2 o'clock mark and want to be conscientious of everyone's time. So I just want to take another minute to thank you all for joining us. Again, when you close out of the webinar, you will see that survey. If you would, please take a minute to complete that and give us some feedback. We know that your time is important and we really appreciate you spending some of it with us today. We hope that you enjoyed this session and found the information valuable as you continue to explore ways to transform your facility strategy and create a new conversation on your campus. Please don't hesitate to contact us via our website, sightlines.com, directly at insights@sightlines.com, or through any of the social channels that you see displayed on the screen if you have additional questions following today's session. Again, thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.